You know, one of the most fascinating and frankly disturbing dynamics of human relationships is the psychological game that emerges when one person decides to reclaim their voice through silence. It's not just about withholding words, it's about withdrawing supply, and when that supply is narcissistic in nature, when it's been sustaining someone who refuses to carry the burden of their own emotional responsibility, well, then you're not just stepping back, you're disrupting a cycle that for them feels like life itself. And what happens then? Silence in its most potent form is not passive. It is not merely the absence of noise or communication. It is a restructuring of a relationship dynamic that had up until that moment been running on an unspoken agreement that the narcissist speaks, and you respond, they provoke, and you react, they demand, and you deliver. This silent withdrawal then is not just a change in behavior. It is a symbolic refusal to participate in a game rigged from the start. And to the narcissist, that shift is nothing short of a psychological earthquake. You are no longer providing the fuel, attention, emotion, validation that kept their inner machinery turning. What many fail to realize is that narcissistic personalities are not fundamentally built on secure self-structure. They rely heavily, often exclusively, on external reinforcement to stabilize their fragile sense of self. So when you go silent, you're not just removing your voice, you're removing their scaffolding. Predictability of the narcissistic script depends on the pattern of provocation and supply. They say something condescending, you defend yourself. They withdraw affection, you chase it. They create chaos, and you try to restore peace. Every reaction reinforces their sense of control, but silence cuts the puppet strings. Silence says, I will no longer participate in your need to distort reality to suit your ego. And because narcissists construct their identities around control and manipulation, your lack of reaction threatens the very core of who they believe themselves to be. Without someone to echo their inflated sense of importance or to absorb the blows of their inner chaos, they are forced to sit in discomfort of their own unregulated emotions, something they are profoundly unequipped to handle. In psychological terms, this is a form of narcissistic injury. And it's severe. It's not simply bruising the ego, it's shattering the illusion of omnipotence. They've been carefully maintaining the silence. Acts as a mirror reflecting their lack of true connection, their dependence on your emotional labor, where once your response is filled in the gaps in their identity, now there's just empty space. This is intolerable for someone whose internal architecture is hollow. They are not built for introspection, because introspection would force them to confront the truth of their own insufficiency. That's why silence is more than avoidance, it's confrontation. It's a direct challenge to their perceived dominance. Even though not a word is spoken, the silence also disrupts the rhythm they've come to rely on. Narcissists thrive on cycles: idealization, devaluation, discard, and hoovering. These phases are not random. They are deliberate pattern strategies designed to maximize control and maintain superiority. Your silence interrupts that rhythm. It doesn't fit into any of their usual tactics. If they attempt provoke, there's no response. If they try to guilt trip, the silence remains. If they shift to love bombing, it falls into a void. You've stopped playing the game, and the game cannot continue with just one player. That terrifies them. Narcissists are masterful at performing for an audience, but when the audience walks away, they lose the script. The performance falters. They can no longer test boundaries, extract reactions, or reinforce their sense of specialness. And then comes the desperation, often masked as indignation or indifference. This stage is when they begin probing for weaknesses in your resolve. They may start with subtle jabs, then escalate into overt manipulation. They will test whether the silence is real, whether your absence is permanent, whether they still hold sway over your emotions. Each attempt is a psychological litmus test. If you respond even slightly, they regain footing, but if you hold the line, the illusion that they are in control begins to collapse. This is where the narcissist becomes erratic, because their identity has lost its anchor. What's crucial to understand is that this disruption does not just reveal the narcissist's fragility, it also reveals your power. Very act of withholding what they crave, your attention, your emotional energy, your validation, reorganizes the entire dynamic. Your silence is not emptiness, it is structure. It is order where there was chaos. And to someone who thrives in psychological entropy, that kind of order is terrifying. They don't know how to function in stability, because stability offers no drama, no spotlight, no opportunity for dominance. So they scramble, they attempt to manufacture crises to tempt you back into familiar roles. But the structure you've introduced through silence is not easily undone. It forces a confrontation. Not just between you and them, but between them and themselves. They are left alone with their narrative, unable to provoke anyone else to co-author it. The silence then becomes a psychological wedge that separates the narcissist from the very mechanisms they use to survive. Control for the narcissist is not simply a preference, it is a necessity. Their entire psychological framework depends on the illusion that they are the dominant force in every relationship they inhabit. This illusion is fragile, propped up by external sources of validation and a carefully crafted narrative in which they are always the superior, the righteous, the victim, or the hero. Whichever role best maintains control. In the moment when you go silent, you withdraw not only your voice, but also your participation in that illusion. You are no longer mirroring their projected identity, no longer giving them emotional cues to manipulate, and in that silence, something unthinkable begins to occur: the collapse of control. The narcissist, whose sense of self is externally regulated, begins to experience a fracture that exposes the hollowness of their internal world. This collapse does not occur all at once. It is a gradual unraveling, often masked by exaggerated displays of confidence or sudden emotional outbursts. But beneath the surface, the narcissist is losing grip. Without your reactions, they are left in a vacuum where their usual tactics yield nothing. They rely on cycles of engagement, conflict, seduction, guilt, flattery to keep others in motion around them, to keep their own reflection visible through your responses. Silence erases that reflection. There is no mirror, no audience, no stage, and that absence confronts them with a reality they have always avoided. They are not in control, not even of themselves. Collapse of control is experienced internally by the narcissist as confusion, panic, and often rage. These emotions are difficult for them to process because they are deeply unfamiliar with self-regulation. Most narcissists lack the emotional architecture to navigate discomfort or uncertainty without blaming it on someone else for their entire life. They've externalized responsibility. If they feel insecure, it's because someone else made them feel that way. If they fail, it's because others sabotage them. This deflection is not a strategic lie, it is a psychological necessity. Admitting that instability is internal would mean confronting the emptiness they have spent years avoiding. Your silence then acts like a spotlight on that emptiness. They cannot manipulate silence, they cannot guilt-trip silence, they cannot seduce silence, and so they begin to unravel. There is also a profound identity crisis that arises when control slips away. Narcissists don't just lose control of others, they lose control of their self-immune. They've built their identity in relation to how others perceive them. Every compliment, every act of submission, every emotional response from others is integrated into their sense of self. When that input stops, so does the feedback loop that keeps their identity intact. They may try to restore this loop by provoking others, escalating behaviors, or switching targets altogether. But the original wound remains. Someone walked away, someone stayed silent, someone refused to be controlled. That reality contradicts the narrative they've built, and contradictions are intolerable for the narcissistic psyche. Often in the face of this collapse, they will attempt to regain control through more extreme measures. This could take the form of character assassination, playing the victim to mutual acquaintances, or launching a campaign of triangulation using new sources of supply. These are not acts of strength, they are acts of desperation. They need to prove to themselves, and to anyone who will listen, that they are still powerful, still important, still in charge. Behind these tactics is a crumbling structure, a person desperately trying to put the pieces back together without admitting they're broken. What's crucial to understand is that your silence didn't cause this collapse, it revealed it. The control they thought they had was never real, it was contingent on your willingness to respond, to engage, to comply. Once you stepped away, the scaffolding began to fall. And this moment of collapse is deeply significant. It shows just how dependent the narcissist has been on external manipulation. It shows that their sense of superiority was never self-sustained. The absence of your voice removes the illusion of power, and what's left is a chaotic interior world they have spent a lifetime trying to keep hidden. This collapse also marks the beginning of a desperate effort to re-establish dominance. They may switch from rage to charm, from insults to flattery, from silence to sudden contact, but these are not signs of confidence, they are signs of instability. A narcissist who truly believed they were in control would not need to chase, to provoke, or to manipulate. Once control was lost, their frantic behavior reveals how deeply threatened they are by the loss of their psychological grip on you. They are no longer the architect of the narrative, and they don't know how to live outside that role, so they spiral not because you harm them, but because your silence unveiled their dependence on the very thing they pretended to be above. When the narcissist senses that their control is slipping, when their attempts to draw you back into their drama through subtle manipulations have failed, they begin to panic, not outwardly at first. Narcissists are strategists. They don't operate from emotional authenticity, they operate from a calculated perception of what works. The silence you maintain unsettles them because it deprives them of the emotional feedback they depend on. Initially, they may try to re-engage you through charm or nostalgia. What is commonly referred to as hoovering, they might suddenly remember shared memories, speak in tones of regret, or act as though they have come to some deep realization, but this is not born from genuine reflection or remorse. It is a tactic, a maneuver, a calculated attempt to pull you back into a role where your energy once served their emotional needs. If that approach fails, the mask begins to crack, their internal chaos starts to seep out. When charm no longer works, they escalate. The narcissist may shift into anger, confusion, or even full-blown rage. This transition is not random, it is part of a pattern cycle. They are testing, probing, trying to determine which emotional lever still has power. The hoovering, which once might have worked to reset the relationship and re-establish the old dynamic, now loses its effectiveness. Your silence has rewritten the rules, and they find themselves without a script. This is when desperation breeds volatility. Without the anchor of predictable reactions, they feel disoriented. The facade of superiority begins to crumble, and they start to lash out, often in ways that are cruel, erratic, and revealing. What is critical to understand is that the narcissist's rage is not primarily about you. It is about their unraveling sense of identity. Your silence has forced them into a confrontation with their own lack of emotional maturity, their dependence on others for validation, and their inability to regulate their own emotional states. The narcissist is experiencing abandonment, but not in the healthy way that allows for grief and growth. They are experiencing abandonment as annihilation. You are not a partner to them, you are a mirror, and now that the mirror is gone, they are left to face the empty, distorted image of themselves that they have spent years avoiding. Their attempts to reassert power may take many forms. They may attempt to undermine your credibility through gossip or slander. They may reach out to mutual connections to gather information or to control the narrative. They might alternate between threats and pleas, anger and affection. The inconsistency is not a flaw in their approach. It is the approach. They are throwing emotional darts, seeing which one will stick. They need to get a reaction because any reaction reopens the door. Any response, no matter how small, serves as evidence that they still matter, that they still have access. And so the pressure increases. They do not escalate because they are strong, they escalate because they are unraveling. Rage is often the last tool in their arsenal. It is unrefined, volatile, and emotionally exhausting for both of you. When all else fails, they may resort to insults, threats, or even emotional blackmail. They will project, accuse, and distort. The rage is not just aimed at you, it is an outward expression of their inner implosion. This phase can be especially dangerous, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a psychological one. The narcissist is no longer engaging with reality. They are engaging with the collapse of their carefully constructed illusion in their mind. Your silence is betrayal, even treason, because to them, a person who refuses to be controlled is a threat that must be neutralized. Your silence forces them to experience something they've spent their entire life avoiding: helplessness, and helplessness for the narcissist is intolerable. They were never taught how to sit with discomfort, how to introspect, how to accept fault or grieve a loss without blame. So when you refuse to play along, when you deny them the emotional oxygen they crave, they erupt. The person who once positioned themselves as superior, all-knowing and unbothered, is now reacting in ways that betray their inner instability, and the more they react, the more their true self is exposed. They may cycle back into hoovering again once the rage cools, and they believe charm might work. Once more, the cycle is not linear, it is recursive, but each time they loop, your silence deepens the rupture. Each failed attempt chips away at their illusion of omnipotence, and with every silence you maintain, you are communicating a message far more powerful than any words could deliver: that you are no longer under their control, that their ability to manipulate your emotions, your mind, and your choices has been permanently severed, and that realization sends them spiraling into phases of emotional desperation. that they cannot manage without access to your response. When you go silent, the narcissist is forced to operate in a space where their usual arsenal manipulation, gaslighting, love-bombing, triangulation, suddenly becomes ineffective. The energy they once pulled from you through arguments, emotional reactions, and validation is gone. This withdrawal reveals something deeply unsettling for them. Their strength was never real. It was never internal. It was borrowed, extracted, and stolen from those who were willing to engage with their false reality. When you take away the engagement, you take away the illusion of power. In that space of quiet, a mirror appears one they've spent their entire life avoiding, and in it, the image is not the confident, charming, powerful persona they have carefully constructed. It is the insecure, fearful, and emotionally fragmented self that exists underneath. This unraveling happens in stages. At first, they attempt to rationalize your silence through denial. They convince themselves that you're playing games, that you'll come back, that you're weak, or just trying to provoke a reaction. This allows them to maintain the illusion that they are still in control, but as time passes and the silence deepens, that illusion becomes harder to maintain. Their inner world, which has always been built around appearances and domination, begins to feel the emptiness they've kept at bay. Constant validation begins to grow, and without your attention to regulate their fragile ego, they become erratic, unstable, and more overtly insecure. What becomes apparent is that their perceived strength, what they projected through grandiosity, arrogance, or cold detachment, was entirely dependent on the emotional responses of others. They needed someone to believe in their superiority in order to feel superior. They needed someone to react to their insults in order to feel powerful. They needed someone to chase them in order to feel worthy. Once you go silent, that external validation stops, and the narcissist is forced to confront the fact that their sense of self is not rooted in anything internal. It is reactive, conditional, and fundamentally weak. They often try to compensate for this by overcorrecting. You may see sudden displays of forced confidence, exaggerated happiness on social media, or boastful stories designed to send a message, "I'm fine without you," but these are not signs of healing or strength. They are defense mechanisms designed to shield them from their own crumbling identity. They cannot afford to let the world or themselves see that they are affected, so they create a performance. But the problem is, performances require an audience, and your silence removes the stage. Without you watching, reacting, or caring, they're left performing in an empty theater, increasingly desperate for someone to notice. At this point, the narcissist may try to manufacture new sources of supply. They may quickly jump into a new relationship, not because they've moved on, but because they need someone else to continue the narrative of their self-importance. The new person becomes the next mirror, the next energy source. But even this doesn't restore their strength, because they know deep down that it's not real. The ease with which they replace people reveals the transactional nature of their connection. And in the quiet of their own thoughts, they feel the growing fear that they are hollow without someone else to reflect back a false version of themselves. The internal instability grows because the silent treatment you maintain becomes a boundary they cannot breach, and narcissists cannot tolerate boundaries they didn't create. Boundaries tell them, "This is where you end and I begin." And for someone who has spent their life merging control with identity, this separation is unbearable. They are not used to being powerless, and even more so, they are not used to being irrelevant. Your silence has not only ended the game, it has removed them from the board entirely, and without a position to play, they flounder. They may spiral into temporary depression, seek revenge, or create elaborate stories to regain a sense of control over the narrative. But it all comes from the same place: fear of their own insignificance. What they fail to grasp is that true strength is quiet, it is internal, it is the ability to sit with yourself, to self-regulate, to face uncomfortable truths and grow from them. These are traits they have never cultivated because their life has been a constant quest to avoid internal discomfort. By controlling external circumstances, your silence leaves them alone with the very thing they've always feared themselves. And in that solitude, they begin to unravel, not because you did anything to them, but because you stopped doing everything for them. The strength they once projected begins to wither in the absence of your energy, and slowly the facade collapses, revealing just how much of their power was an illusion constructed through dependency and deception. When the narcissist can no longer reach you, no longer trigger a reaction, no longer extract emotional fuel, they begin to experience a quiet but potent kind of fear. The fear of irrelevance. It is not simply the loss of control that disturbs them, it is the realization that they have been erased from the emotional world of someone they once deemed a source of power, admiration, or submission. The narcissist's sense of self is not rooted in who they are, but in how others perceive and respond to them. So when you go silent, when you stop defending yourself, explaining, engaging, or reacting, you don't just reject their tactics, you nullify their existence in your life. And for someone whose identity depends on being seen, feared, admired, or obeyed, this silence is not peace, it is psychological annihilation. They may try to tell themselves that you are weak, that you're sulking, that you'll return once you calm down. This helps them preserve their sense of superiority in the beginning, but over time, if your silence is consistent and firm, the stories they tell themselves begin to fracture. They start to question why they haven't been able to break you, why you no longer care, why their words and actions now fall into a void without consequence. This dissonance between their self-perception and reality grows heavier, more threatening, and instead of adapting or maturing, the narcissist clings harder to their distorted sense of identity, launching new attempts to resurrect the past dynamic. But each attempt is met with your silence, and it reminds them that their tools have become useless. The fear of irrelevance pushes them into desperation, and desperation manifests in unpredictable ways. Some narcissists become stalkers of your emotional life from afar or through mutual channels, trying to find any sign that you still think of them. They might manufacture events just to get your attention, provoke you through indirect means, or manipulate mutual acquaintances to keep tabs on your emotions. They may even appear calm or indifferent on the surface, while secretly unraveling, trying to make sense of the fact that you are living, thriving, and functioning without them. This is not just offensive to their ego, it is incomprehensible, because in their world, people are supposed to orbit around them. The idea that someone can detach, heal, and grow without them is not just unacceptable, it's humiliating. In this state of psychological disarray, some narcissists retreat inward temporarily, but even this retreat is not introspective in a healthy sense. It is a strategy. They might begin to craft a new version of themselves to appeal to others, a mask built from whatever fragments they think will gain them favor. Again, they study your silence not to understand you, but to decode it and use it against you. They may return with what appears to be vulnerability, humility, or even an apology, but beneath it lies a motive to restore their sense of control. True remorse requires empathy and self-awareness, both of which the narcissist lacks. What you are witnessing is not transformation, but reinvention designed to regain access. Others will double down on their hostility. They will twist your silence into accusations. You're cold, you're manipulative, you're the narcissist. This role reversal tactic serves two functions. It offloads their shame and attempts to bait you into defending yourself, because once you defend yourself, you've broken your silence. Once you engage, they are no longer irrelevant. The game resumes, and their ego is reassured. They want to provoke any emotion from you, because any emotion, anger, guilt, sadness, is proof that they still have psychological presence in your world. Your silence, on the other hand, is the only thing that denies them this power completely. There's a reason narcissists are so addicted to chaos. In chaos, they are needed. In conflict, they are central. In emotional turbulence, they are the puppet master, but in silence they vanish. Your refusal to react takes away the one thing they crave more than love or admiration: significance. And this is what breaks them far more than words ever could. Their strategies become increasingly frantic, less effective, more transparent. Their once polished tactics begin to look desperate, even pitiful. And in this unraveling, the true nature of their strength is revealed. It was never real strength. It was an illusion made possible only through your cooperation. They feel invisible now, not because you harmed them, but because you stopped enabling the fantasy that they mattered more than they did. And they cannot tolerate being invisible. Visibility is their currency. It is how they measure their worth. Without your gaze, your attention, your emotional energy, they start to disintegrate into what they've always feared they were. Deep down, forgotten, ordinary, replaceable, they built an empire of self-importance on the foundation of your reactions. And when you take those reactions away, the empire begins to crumble quietly, but completely. The narcissist doesn't mourn your presence, they mourn the loss of their power over your presence. Once the narcissist realizes your silence is not a temporary reaction, but a boundary, they are forced to confront an unfamiliar and terrifying reality: the loss of control over your perception of them. The narcissist's entire sense of self is constructed around the image they project, not the truth of who they are. They have spent their life crafting personas, adapting their behavior to match what they believe others want to see, and using manipulation to maintain dominant When you go silent, they no longer have access to your emotional world. This means they can no longer shape how you see them, which for a narcissist is more painful than rejection itself. They fear not only the loss of admiration, but the exposure of their true fragile identity behind the mask without your reactions. They lose the ability to control the narrative. They begin to imagine what you must be thinking, fearing that your silence is not just detachment, but clarity. They suspect that you're seeing through them now, that the illusion is broken, and the truths they worked so hard to hide have finally been uncovered. This realization puts them in a state of existential panic. You no longer believe in them. Constructed persona, it threatens the very core of their self. Worth, which was never self, generated to begin with your silence, becomes more than absence. It becomes a mirror reflecting their irrelevance, their lack of substance, their emotional fraudulence. They attempt to reclaim this lost image by building new narratives, often with new people trying to re-establish their sense of superiority. These stories are not told with honesty, but with distortion. They might cast themselves as the victim, claiming you were abusive, cold, or unstable. They need others to buy into this version, so they can't continue to believe it themselves. They are not merely protecting their reputation, they're protecting their self. Delusion, but no matter how convincing they try to be to the outside world, something inside them knows the truth. They know that they couldn't manipulate you anymore, and that knowledge corrodes their sense of control. The longer your silence persists, the deeper their inner chaos grows. The facade that once protected them starts to feel like a prison without someone to project onto. They are stuck with themselves, and that is the last place a narcissist wants to be. They may experience sudden bouts of emptiness, rage, or depression, none of which they know how to process. These are feelings they have long outsourced onto others through blame and projection. Now they are forced to carry them alone, and it overwhelms them. They have no internal tools for emotional regulation because they've spent a lifetime avoiding responsibility for their own feelings. This is often when the narcissist will begin to disintegrate internally. Outwardly, they may seem composed, even thriving as they craft a new public image or jump into a new relationship, but inwardly they are losing the scaffolding that held their ego together. The realization that they no longer control your view of them is a crack in the foundation that quickly spreads. They fear your autonomy, your growth, your detachment, because it proves you were never as weak, dependent, or naive as they needed you to be. It proves that their power over you was temporary, and that they were never truly as powerful as they imagined. They may oscillate between obsessive preoccupation and total emotional shutdown. The narcissist often doesn't know whether to retaliate, beg, or pretend to move on, because nothing is working. Your silence has removed the emotional map they used to navigate their dominance. They cannot predict your next move, cannot interpret your lack of engagement, cannot find an emotional doorway to re-enter your world. This unpredictability enrages them, not because they miss you, but because they miss control, and without that control, they feel helpless, exposed, and profoundly unimportant. What you've done by remaining silent is disrupt the narcissist's entire reality. You've ended the cycle they depended on for psychological survival. You've broken the pattern they counted on to feel in control, and most significantly, you've invalidated the fantasy they built around their importance in your life. This does not just hurt their feelings, it threatens their identity, because their sense of self has never been stable or rooted in truth, but in the ability to manipulate how others perceive them. When you no longer perceive them at all, when you no longer react, fear, admire, or resist them, you take away the oxygen that fuels their false self, and what's left is a silence they cannot manipulate, a boundary they cannot cross, and a version of you they can no longer reach or redefine.